So good afternoon and welcome to the UpSkill Works Forum series. The series is designed to engage business, education, and community leaders along with policymakers and leading thinkers on some of the key workforce issues our region and our nation confront. I'm Peter Beard and I lead the Greater Houston Partnership's UpSkill Houston initiative. And we bring together a collective table of business, education, public, and community leaders all to work together in developing a highly skilled workforce that our employers need, and that also create good pathways to success for our region's residents. And that's the primary topic of today, is how do we create that opportunity? Before we get to our conversation about this topic, about individuals who obtain skills through alternative routes, and you'll hear this word STARS throughout this thing, throughout the webinar, I just want to provide a few housekeeping details. All attendees are muted and your videos are turned off for the entirety of the webinar. Please do not use the chat function for questions and answers. This will not be moderated for questions. Please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. If you're having technical difficulties, please use the chat function and connect with our team here to correct any of those. The Greater Houston Partnership and its UpSkill Houston initiative would like to acknowledge and thank our 2022 Forum Series sponsors. We're excited to kind of acknowledge the number of folks that provide support to make this series possible. That includes Accenture, Houston Community College, Texas Mutual Insurance, Winstead, PC. It also includes Burns and McDonald, Lone Star College, Mustang Cat, San Jacinto College, Silver Eagle Distributors Houston, Worley, HCA Houston Healthcare, Ineos, Olefins, and Polymers. I'd now like to welcome Mary Beth Gracie of Accenture to introduce today's very special guest. Mary Beth serves as the Office Managing Director of Accenture's Houston office, which houses more than 2,000 employees. Some of you may remember that Mary Beth joined us last June when we hosted Joe Fuller to talk about a related topic of how Houston can grow the role of apprenticeships, which is also a great way to address this STARS population. Welcome back, Mary Beth. It's a pleasure to have you here today, and the partnership thanks you and your leadership and Accenture's support for this UpSkill Forum series. We also appreciate the leadership you, Accenture, and Aon have provided in creating and growing the Greater Houston Apprentice Network. Welcome, Mary Beth.
Thank you. Yes, Accenture is proud to continue to partner with UpSkill Houston and support these virtual sessions that cover important workforce topics in the Houston region. And as you mentioned, this is an important topic and one that Accenture has a strong interest in, both because of our interest in promoting equity, diversity, and inclusion, but also serving the needs of our growing workforce and our needs for more in our workforce. I'm also excited to be here to introduce Byron because Accenture has also been a partner with Opportunity at Work in some of its research and in various other ways. So it is a pleasure to be here and to introduce Byron today. Let me tell you a little bit about his very distinguished career. There's a lot of variety in here, which I'm sure everyone will be interested in. First off, Byron co-founded Opportunity at Work in 2015 to develop tech-enabled solutions to help solve this opportunity gap and to work with partners who can help rewire the labor market so that everyone can contribute their skills, their talent, and their energy in pursuit of a better life. And then prior to creating Opportunity at Work, Byron served for 2 years in the White House as Deputy Assistant to the President for Economic Policy and Deputy Director of the National Economic Council. And his policy portfolio there included job creation and labor markets, skills and workforce policies, innovation, investment, infrastructure, transportation, and goods movement. So I'm sure you're wondering, what did all those other people do? That's quite a portfolio there. And then until 2013, he was a senior partner at McKinsey & Company in Washington, D.C., as well as some time in Los Angeles. During his tenure with McKinsey, he worked primarily in the fields of technology and communications, information and media, services-based businesses, education, economic development, and he led McKinsey's high-tech services sector for 4 years, and its global social sector for 5 years up until 2012. So it's indeed a pleasure to have him here. I'll turn it back to you, Peter, to kick this off, and I'm looking forward to the great discussion.
And thanks, Mary Beth. It's always a pleasure to have you and Accenture as a part of this. And Byron, it's truly a treat to have you join us today. You know, and as Mary Beth noted, it's quite a distinguished career. McKinsey, the Obama administration, and now the founder of this great, organization, Opportunity at Work. Yet I know kind of the work that you're doing has a personal story to it. And I know someone in your family is a star, and it's someone you're very proud of. Could you kind of give us a little peek into kind of what motivated you in this?
Yeah, thank you, Peter, and thank you, Mary Beth, for the introduction. Well, I mean, actually, lots of people in my family are stars. I have a huge extended family, but I will say, when I was working on an initiative called Tech Hire at the White House that we came together to on tech jobs, but I realized that my own father in 1970, 71. He spent a year in college. He didn't come close to completing, and he was working as a shipping clerk in a factory in Detroit. And he saw in 1970 an ad in a newspaper saying, learn COBOL and punch your own ticket or something like that. And, the COBOL was the IBM mainframe language. There was huge demand for it at the time, not enough of it taught in school. And so he had to actually look up what it was. He had never worked in technology. He had never worked in an office, but my mom had a job. He didn't think he was going anywhere. He studied COBOL for 5 months, and I still have his certificate from Control Data Corp. And then he got a job shadow. Someone at Detroit Edison gave him a job shadow, and they gave him a little bit of sort of what we now call a performance task. And he got a job as an entry-level programmer. And that was the shift in trajectory of my family into the American middle class. And so, as I look at it in 1970, when there were a lot of barriers, presumably there was more discrimination against my father as a Black man in 1970, 71 than there is today. But there was less discrimination against him as someone who didn't have a bachelor's degree. It was much easier then than it is today for him to just, hey, let's see what you can do. And if you can do something, right, if you can do the job, you can get the job. And so I just think that this is a problem that we can solve as hear about the skills gap or the labor shortage, the great resignation. And if you look at the kind of numbers people are talking about, far more people like my father are being excluded today. And I've now met hundreds of them. And these are not people who are even out of work. They're working. They can do more. They know it. I've heard so many people say in different ways, I know what I can do, but no one will give me a chance. And we need a system that doesn't spend so much money and time trying to pre-decide who gets to try. And we need a system that allows everyone to put their best foot forward and get as far as they can.
And I know we're going to talk a little bit about this, but I mean, I love the story, partly because it just personalizes it in a great way. And I know you've done a lot of research to understand this population, and so I'd be interested in, how many are there in the U.S.? Who are they? Where are they? And then you kind of hinted at something. People don't see barriers to this, and I think there are barriers that are probably personal to them, but there are also barriers that are probably a little more systemic from the employers. And so I'd be interested if you could just set the stage for this population for us.
Yeah, sure. So we talk about stars, people who are skilled through alternative routes. And that's important because we're talking about people with skills. So by the definitionally, it's people with high school degrees or equivalent. It's people who are attached to the labor market they're working. They might be working in a call center. They might be working, in a warehouse, but and it's important because they are gaining these skills. So when we say skilled through alternative routes, what routes are we talking about? We might be talking about military service. We might be talking about community colleges, coding boot camps. There are more ways to learn than ever, but the most important way we're talking about is on the job. People are learning a tremendous amount that's valuable on the job. And so just to put it in context of numbers, there are 70 million stars, a little over 70 million stars in the United States. That's about half our workforce. And I think of STARS as the other skilled workforce. I mean, we tend to think of people with bachelor's degrees and other advanced degrees as the skilled workforce, but STARS are tremendously skilled workforce. And we all saw this in the pandemic, the adaptiveness, the resourcefulness, the reconfiguring of supply chains, the changes in safety protocols. If you look at that kind of work is exactly the kind of adaptive workforce that companies are saying they need all the time. And a lot of these folks are right in front of their eyes. They might be working for your company. And you're right, Peter, to say that there are systemic barriers, the most obvious of which is this tremendous drift in using a bachelor's degree, quote unquote, requirement as a screening mechanism, a pre-screening mechanism for jobs. To put that in context, over the last decade or so prior to the pandemic, you probably had almost 70% of new jobs were jobs that employers typically tried to require a bachelor's degree, but only 40% of the workforce has a bachelor's degree. So the arithmetic is just wildly off. And when your war for talent becomes a war against basic arithmetic, it's a war you're going to lose. So that's where we are.
No, and that's a helpful way. And then just to put it in context here in Houston, and to your point, starting today and going into the future, somewhere between 60 or 70% of the jobs are going to require education and skills beyond a high school diploma. And the math doesn't work here in Houston. So if if we think about it in kind of two different populations, one is the population of youth flowing through the education system, that are either going to go directly into the workforce, go to community college, or go to a four-year institution. And our track record is not very good, because in Harris County, through some of the cohort studies that have been done, we know somewhere between only 20 and 25% of students complete within 6 years some form of post-secondary credential. And so we have 75% of our population, of the student population flowing into the workforce that are potential stars, but we're going to have to figure out how to kind of continue to support them. And I know this isn't really the topic, but the other reality that I think you get to is 40% of our adult population have high school diploma or less. And then 20% have some college, but no degree. So that, to your point, we have 60% that are potential stars, and stars that we should be looking at very differently in order to address kind of that mismatch of what we think most of these jobs are requiring, and we're seeing the acceleration.
Yeah. And Peter, I think that's a very helpful characterization of the situation in Houston. And I think the piece that maybe people don't think hard enough about is when you talk about they need education beyond high school. They need learning. I might put it, they need learning beyond high school. They need a lot of learning. But of course, you can get learning in a classroom environment. You can get learning on the job. You can get learning in a mix of the two. And in some ways, what I would argue is that we have sort of baked ourselves into a set of systemic assumptions. They're not gravity, they're choices. I mean, they're kind of institutional choices that actually make it almost impossible for us to succeed. So I heard some of the names of the institutions, the community colleges and so forth here. I just think community colleges and frankly, the entire higher ed system is just an incredible asset to Houston, to Texas, to the United States. But if you put all the burden of mastering job skills, say on a community college program, that's not reasonable, because actually it's a mix of that classroom engagement and the work. And if it was actually possible for people to get frontline jobs, which you could get sort of out of high school, and to be earning money, and for the skills they're gaining there to count, and to be marrying that to community college programs or short course programs and the rest of it, you would both have people, and then as they gain more skills, be able to get better paying jobs and not just have to wait until the end of 6 years. Part of why it takes 6 years or you never get there is because you run out of money. That's kind of the biggest reason. Or in order to get the money, you have a work schedule that conflicts with your class schedule. There's so many ways that the current system puts all the burden onto the working learner to sort of get there and navigate this whole system. And then on top of that, you have this, what I consider completely self-harming degree screen, where it's companies are saying they want skills, and they do, but they screen out 60% of people before they know anything about their skills whatsoever. And that is the issue. And there's a better way to do it.
And I think there are two pieces. One, when you opened, you were talking about the adaptive skills that only get developed in the workplace, which are really hard to develop in an educational setting because of a whole
purely
bunch of
in
other
an
things.
purely. I mean, education settings can contribute to them, but to do it purely in education is, I think, asking too much.
Yeah, and we know what employers are asking for. And then the role of education should be almost that next mile of technical training that gets someone who has those adaptive skills. The other point, and I know you have you've done some really good research that will help set even some more context, and we'll get to that in just a second, is we also know that the populations we're describing in this space are, skew female, and they skew from communities of color, which is also, as we think about this whole idea of Houston being the most diverse city in the country, how are we actually going to have our workforce at all levels reflect the diversity of our city? And so I know an underlying current we have to confront also is this important opportunity to help diversify our workforce and grow it in a different way.
Yeah. So Peter, it's a very important, understanding this dynamic is a very important part of diversifying the workforce, but I would say on multiple dimensions. And so for one thing, half of white workers are stars, right? So this is actually American middle class. Now, you're right to say, so over 60% of Black workers are stars, and close to 60% of Hispanic workers are stars. By the way, almost 70% of rural American workers of all backgrounds are stars. If you have veterans coming out of service as in the enlisted ranks, nearly 90% of them are stars, and veterans overall, well north of 60% are stars. So so there are a number of different kind of dimensions to this, and you alluded to people who have some college but no degree. That's a huge number of people in this country. I mean, that's like 20, 30 million people, and there's so much talent, and you know it's true. And we have the receipts now, because I think one of the big biases we have that stop us from seeing this is we say someone's in a low wage job, we'll call that a low skilled job. Just like, it's low wage, so it's low skill, but low wage jobs are not mainly low skilled jobs. It's not the same thing. There's a tremendous amount of skill. And one of the contributions Opportunity at Work has made, and one of the assets we have for partners, like Greater Houston Partnership and others we work with, is a database of skills distance. And we worked on this initially with Accenture, a skills distance between every job and every other job. And when you look at it, you start to notice that there's huge skill similarities between many low wage jobs and many middle wage jobs. So much so that you have 30 million out of 70 million stars today have the skills for jobs that pay at least 50% more than the ones they're in. And so there are genuine skills gaps in some highly specialized fields, but a lot of these middle wage jobs where companies are having trouble getting hiring people there's plenty of people with that talent pool. You're looking in the wrong place.
And I know you've done some really good work on this, and you have probably a couple slides that just would help people see the visual nature of what we're talking about. And I think that will be helpful. And then I want to remind the audience to please submit, questions and answers. We'll be taking some time shortly to answer some of those. I'll probably also embed them in here, but I know that those visuals will actually help the audience understand some of the great work you've done, Byron.
Yeah, happy to do that. So, oh, great. Okay, so the slides we're showing you here come from one of our latest reports. We've done a series of reports on stars, and the reports are really the packaging. The underlying data set is where the power is. This latest report came out this January. It was called Rise with the Stars. So this concept, though, so low wage is not equal low skill. What you're seeing on the slide are a simplified version of the skills required and the ranking of the skills required for a retail salesperson who might make, just national average. This might be little over $18 an hour, and a sales representative more in the business to business side, wholesale. So making $31 an hour. So quite a lot more. And the most of the data comes from the ONET database of the Department of Labor. But the thing to note here is that when you actually look at the skills, the persuasion, the active listening, service orientation, negotiation, these are skills that actually, there's a very close mapping. They're not a very different skill set. And yet one job makes something like 65%, more in wage than the other. And so what the question we asked at Opportunity at Work, there's a lot of barriers, but actually we also see that people make transitions, and you see this on the next slide. So in other words, there's skills proximity between these two jobs. Do people actually make these transitions? So in addition to our database of the skills proximities, we have a database of 130 million actual job transitions that people have made over the 10 years running up to the start of the pandemic. And what we see is that, yes, in fact, people do make skills based moves. Everyone does, actually. People with bachelor's degrees do. The difference being, if you have a bachelor's degree, particularly a selective one, you're kind of allowed to make bigger skills leap. I mean, a lot of us will recognize this phenomenon. We can get a job that there's a lot of things we don't quite know how to do, and it's expected that we'll learn it. Stars typically make smaller skills leaps, and only 40% of job transitions by stars actually get them a higher wage, which we consider a problem because they're building skills along the way. But when do stars move? And this concept here, we think, is very powerful. You'll see on the left, there's origin jobs. And then we highlight a gateway job, which in this case is the customer service representative, and then destination jobs. So origin jobs tend to be lower wage. A lot of people work in those jobs. And a destination job tends to be higher wage. So you see here, general operations managers, sales representatives, wholesale, and like, those are higher paid jobs. 51 jobs we've seen are gateway jobs, and these play a special role. Gateway jobs like customer service rep, lots of people move into those jobs from lots of different origin jobs. And unlike some other jobs that might pay about the same, a lot of people move out of those jobs into better paid jobs. So those jobs are actually ones where the kinds of skills you're getting. Admin assistant is another example of this. I mean, where you actually are building skills that have tremendous relevance to higher paid jobs. And so people are moving. But the question is, why aren't more people moving? As an example, you mentioned women. So women who are stars are only half as likely as men who are stars, a little bit more than half, but pretty close to half as likely to make a wage gain when they make a job transition based on skills. Black stars in this country are only half as likely as white stars to make an upwardly mobile transition. And this is all normed for equivalent skill sets. Okay, so I think there's to the point about diversity, there's a couple of things going on here. One is Black Americans in the workforce are more likely to be stars than white Americans, somewhat more likely, but even more so because we're only giving really credit for the bachelor's degree. This becomes sort of the Wild West for stars. It's sort of battlefield promotion, like you're already doing the job, so maybe I'll promote you who looks like they're doing the job. And I can tell you there are so many examples, and this is where a lot of we hit a wall on diversity where I mean, I can't tell you the number of Black women I've seen like actually doing the job and not being promoted into the job. And a lot of that corresponds with not having a bachelor's degree. So
before we leave this slide, I think there are a couple things to the conversation you were just elevating. One, it begins to create a pay disparity for the same productivity that someone's delivering to an employer.
That's right.
And then the second piece, and when we look at this, from a broad workforce system, this slide is helpful for probably two of our main stakeholders. One, the career coaches and counselors that are working with folks that are trying to find that opportunity to help them see a pathway. And we know from some other research that once they begin to see a pathway, they're likely to take the steps because it becomes clear how to do that. The second one is really the employers, which is, to your point, you de-risk yourself by elevating and moving people from within your organization because they're already here. You don't have to re-recruit them. You don't have to assume the risk. and that these tools can therefore become very helpful for creating that economic mobility, but also to where we were going, improve productivity of your entire workforce.
Yes, absolutely. And this is true. This is particularly true, as you allude to, for people who are already working at your company, because you know a lot about them, right, as workers, and you have a lot of ability to create internal career paths and opportunities, and just to stair steps and all the rest of it. So that's very powerful. But even if you don't have, let's say, a large set of customer service representatives working in your company, but you have a need for these other roles, the fact that we know that these skill sets exist and they're tested in the market, because even without intentionality, people are moving through these jobs. So what if we did this on purpose? Like, what if you created short apprenticeship pathways from, let's say, like take customer service representative. You could have a technical upgrade that got you to be a technical help desk person. You could have a managerial top up that had you kind of managing customer service. You could build a sales force. There's a lot of demand like going unmet for good salespeople. A ton of the future good salespeople are sitting in customer service roles, right? It's a lot of the same skill sets, and that is I would say two things about that. One, you're developing a lot of the same skill sets you would in an excellent workforce program like a Year Up or a per school. A lot of the kind of soft skills you're developing them on the job, and then there's way more people in these gateway jobs. So in terms of the scale, and that's a really important thing, we absolutely support and believe and want to see more of the kind of inclusion initiatives, if you will, and the kind of but a big company can do a little bit of anything at once. But to do a lot of something, to mainstream it, it needs to be in a business process. It needs to be at real scale that's material to the company, and it needs to be SaaS enabled, likely. So what we've done in Opportunity at Work is essentially created both the big data sets that allow a company to say, well, for the STARS talent category, and it is a talent category, it's 70 million people. If you don't have a STARS strategy, you don't really have a complete human capital strategy, a complete talent sourcing strategy. You don't. And so what is your strategy? We have the analytics to help you figure that out. And then we, working with partners, very important to us on the ground, who know places, who know the markets, who know the talent developers in the communities, to basically allow them to plug in on the supply side, right? To sort of source stars, and for companies to be able to plug in, that we call this marketplace StellarWorks, and to be able to discover what are the alternative routes where I can find stars that are right for my business. And a lot of those alternative routes in Houston are going to be the very institutions that you mentioned and who are participating in this call. So that's the idea. And we think it's very important to think about stars as a talent category. We think it's very important to get the data so that companies can decide how it's going to work for them. And then we think it's very important to make it easier to lower the bar to get started. And so that's what we've been focused on.
I know we have a couple other visuals, but I'm going to put one kind of exclamation point on this from the business perspective, which is, my hunch would be a lot of these origin jobs are churned. And so you're turning over stars who decide, I can get to work. If I can get a job that pays similar 20 minutes closer to my home, I'm going to take that as opposed to stay with an employer, which has a huge cost, and particularly in today's tight labor market. And so we should be thinking differently about what the economics of it are for the employer. And I know you've got a couple other slides to show.
But I want to underscore what you just said, Peter, because that's true of the economics of the employer. That was true even before the pandemic, but it's particularly true now. And I think what you're going to see, to be honest, there are employers, I know we're working with a lot of them. Accenture is one of them. That are making their move to sort of figure this out, their talent strategy, and they're going to be getting a disproportionate share of stars talent. And you're going to see even more churn in those gateway jobs for the companies that don't get it, right? And that are still, working on the playbook from 15 years ago.
And because I think that's the other thing that's going to show up is folks are going to have to shift industries and not stay in the same one just because of the limitation to it. Let's get through the two other visuals, just because I think they're really helpful to get people to see what's been happening historically, and then, how does Houston rate in terms of all of this?
That's great. Well, the next slide really, this is a sort of an aggregation. This is also from our Rise of the Stars report. What we did here is try to size what is the cost of exclusion based on this. Well, and actually, you said that Joe Fuller had spoken before. I mean, Joe's documented the kind of ridiculous, I mean, honestly, absurd level of extreme use of these bachelor's degree requirements, to the point where, you know, only a third of administrative assistants have a bachelor's degree, but 3/4, 75% of new job postings for administrative assistants say you need to have a bachelor's degree. So when 2/3 of admin assistants are not eligible or not considered qualified for 3/4 of the new jobs in their own field, the jobs they're already doing, you know, we've jumped the shark here. It's ridiculous. And so, but what's the aggregate impact of that? So looking across all the major roles for STARS, over the last 2 decades, since 2000, basically, 7.5 million jobs, right? If STARS had kept their sort of fair share of these gateway and destination jobs, they would have 7.5 million more, right? Better paying jobs. So when you talk about wage stagnation, when you talk about the middle class precarity and the undermining of the middle class in this country, STARS are the middle class of this country. You know, if you go to New York, a struggling orthopedic surgeon might think of themselves as middle class, but like actually in the country as a whole, writ large, in Houston, across the country, STARS are really, that's the center point of the country. And what you're seeing is this systematic exclusion. And again, this isn't a conspiracy theory, right? This was like a modest convenience, right? For kind of when job search went digital, and oh, we can use keyword screens, and now we've got too many resumes, and so you kind of put that screen on, but we've lost the plot. It's gone way too far, and it's now time to bring it back. And if I had to say what companies need to do is, number one, they need to remove these degree screens except where they're absolutely needed. I mean, like civil engineering to build bridges, medical degrees to do surgery, great, but it makes no sense for sales, like admin, secretary. I mean, this is like makes no sense at all. And then they need to find where are the alternative routes where they'd find STARS, and they need to create those career paths. I see some people mentioning apprenticeships. That's a great model. There's several ways to go about it. And I think, and if you go to the next slide, I think that there's a power in not just an individual company doing it, but in a community doing it. And we just started in Rise of the Stars to start to compare the performance of different communities. We have the STARS Mobility Index, and it's pretty simple. I mean, the data underlying it is not so simple, but the idea is 3 variables: economic mobility, the extent to which STARS have been able to transition to higher wage occupations in the past 5 years; the equity, so. And this is something you just referred to, Peter. This is if you're doing the same job as a STAR to someone else as a bachelor's degree, how much pay parity is there? And then on security, economic security, and just sort of ability to earn, what percentage of employed STARS work in occupations to pay above the median wage? And we've worked with, and others have worked with the Federal Reserve Board and some of the regional banks that have created this great opportunity occupations tool that can actually sort of show that. So taking all those together, just looking at it, and look, on the whole, as you can imagine, if as a country as a whole, we're not doing well with STARS, there's not many regions that are doing that well. Denver, Rochester, Virginia Beach, 3 very different kind of economies, are all doing well in certain ways. And we've dug in a little bit, particularly with Denver and Rochester on the whys, and it's quite a fascinating story. We don't have time to get into it. In the bigger metropolises, they don't tend to do very well. Houston, if you see, is in there in the average. And I'm sure that Houston doesn't like to think of itself as average, but I will say Houston is actually the biggest city in this country that made it into the average category, right? The New York, Los Angeles, Chicago are all below average, and we're not quite sure why that is. And we have actually one real strength. We have a STARS research community, a STARS Insights Advisory Panel chaired by Erica Groshin, who is the former head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. But we've now got about 36 researchers digging into all this data, and the data sets are designed for that. big social science research conference, sort of 5 papers. It's a big deal for the academics are using this. And you're going to see STARS as a talent category. And my belief, at the community level, at the metro level, just like I said before, that the companies that figure this out are going to be winning in this talent pool, and other companies that don't bother are going to see much more churn, and they're actually going to pay a cost that they don't yet realize. I think that's true of communities too. I expect certainly 10 years from now, but even 5 years from now, when there's a competitive, some big company is like, where are we going to put our headquarters? Today, talent is a big part of it, but it's really just like those who are bachelor's degrees and beyond. But actually, if you can actually characterize your STARS talent pool as an asset for the community, and the adaptive alternative, the variety of pathways, and so that if a company is transitioning economic activity over the course of 3, 4, 5 years, you actually can get there, even if you don't have all of those exact skill sets right now. You have multiple pathways to deliver it. And I believe that'll be a basis of competitive advantage. And it's something that a city like Houston should be looking at.
Well, and we would agree. And the one thing we can say is at least Dallas is in the same category as we are. And so that's a good thing. And so let's kind of, take a break and take some questions, because there's some really good questions there. And this is really about helping people understand this. But I do think that you're right to this point, Byron, that economic growth is driven by kind of the continued expansion of an economy. And the only way to, at some level, to do that is really to ensure that you're increasing the living standards and mobility of the population. And I think, we had Rob Kaplan here, and he's like, there are 2 ways to address kind of growth. One is people and productivity. And it feels like focusing on STARS is a productivity play on our part.
Yeah, I mean, no, exactly, because we literally have aspects of our system. And I mean, and this is honestly, if we're honest, it's mainly company policy. It's not mainly government policy that's standing in the way. I mean, government policy maybe could be more helpful, but it's mainly kind of company practices. But yeah, we actually, I don't know the number of companies I've talked to that have a $10 million inclusion initiative, but actually spend $100 million year after year on systems to blind themselves to the talent of half the workforce and to stop people from putting forth their best effort. People can do more than they're doing. People can learn more. But if you don't have a system where that learning, because learning is work, right? It's hard and it's stressful to learn new things, but people do it all the time. People want to do it, but they want to learn more so they can earn more. And if we stop half of the workforce from being able to earn more when they learn more, well, that's a pretty bad situation for productivity, for dynamism, for adaptation. But people want to do this. STARS, I can't tell you how much STARS are learners, they're resourceful, they're adaptive, and they're constantly looking for any way, as you say, to find a path. And so if we actually can open up these paths on purpose, there are the companies listening, I would say there are people you don't know who are right now doing everything they can to try to get to your company and to try to show you what they can do. And you've got systems that stop yourself from seeing them. And that's the easiest thing you can change to deal with this labor shortage.
And so those are some of the questions in the Q&A right now. One is really around, to what degree do you find that at least some portion of the reported skills gap for STARS has to do with articulating the existing skill set rather than a competency deficiency?
Yeah, so I can't give you an exact number that I could back up, but it's very clear across the board, but it's very clear that a huge part of the reported skills gap is that deficiency. So the most important and the most important reason is, so I'm an economist, that's my background. And if you actually look at the way economic statistics are collected and reported, when you see a report that says there's a skills gap of X million people, that's actually a degree attainment gap. It's actually saying one of 2 things. It's either saying there's this many, we need more people who have certain degrees, not skills, because they're not measuring skills. They're saying degrees, or even worse, they're making the circular argument that because people are in low wage jobs, that therefore we don't have people with enough skills. So you'll sometimes hear talk of underemployment. And what does that mean? It means you have a bachelor's degree, but you're a server in a restaurant, so you're underemployed. But the implicit idea there is that if you don't have a bachelor's degree and you're a server in a restaurant, you're perfectly appropriately employed. Why would you ever do anything else? But that's not true. And so this is the point. So this notion, this 30 million stars, by the way, so 40% of stars have skills for jobs that pay 50% more than the ones they're in. Those jobs don't pay 50% more out of charity. They pay 50% more because they're higher value jobs. They're more productive. They're more in demand. So there's an enormous number. And by the way, very interestingly, I said earlier that Black stars are only half as likely as white stars to get a wage increase when they make a skills-based transition. Well, the flip side of that, when you run that over and over, it means that 60% of Black stars have the skills today for jobs that pay 50% more. So the flip side, right, of this lesser mobility based on skills and this lesser willingness of employers, as evidenced in the data, to actually have Black stars do the jobs that they can do, means that you could simultaneously fill those gaps and do it in a more racially inclusive way, certainly in a metropolis like Houston. And the final thing I'll say about that is it's not that people don't need to learn new things to do that. And in some cases, like these apprenticeship models, but I think you could, in many cases, you could do things. You have summer internships for college students. You could have fall internships for stars. You could have winter, you could use the methods that you're using, but what you've got to realize is what people need to learn in these cases, they probably need to learn new acronyms. They need to learn some new business processes. They need to learn how to operate some new software, but that's it. And people learn that all the time. Salesforce administrators are in hot demand, right? But there are people working in small businesses, stars working in small businesses across the country that are managing the sales pipelines for those small businesses with Excel spreadsheets, right? Or Google Sheets or something. They're doing harder work for half the pay, and no one is recruiting them to be Salesforce administrators. And you know what? They would think that was a great job, and they would be retained. And right now, instead, you're going after the most poachable college grads, investing to teach them to be Salesforce administrators. And 9 to 15 months later, they want to do something else in your company. Fair enough. But if you limit yourself to that very narrow pool and everybody else does too, well, we see the consequence.
And I think what you're saying in that one, and then we'll get to two questions that are related, which is someone who's doing that in a small business already understands what they need to understand. You're going to have to teach the bachelors about why Salesforce and why sales, management and customer relationship management is important.
Right. So this person needs to, the star in that case, needs to learn how to use the Salesforce software. Okay. But they don't need to learn principles of, like managing a sales pipeline. I mean, they can be improved. Of course, we all learn all the time. But this is the thing. Once you recognize that we're not two species, like people are learners, right? And people want to work, people want to learn, and it gives them a sense of mastery. And it really works. And when you see it in action, I mean, I know the companies that are sourcing stars through StellarWorks, but I mean, there's lots of ways you can do it if you want to, if you have that intention, are discovering amazing talent that bring diverse perspectives. I mean, they might be racially diverse too, but really different life experiences, different understanding of different parts of the market. And there are just so many benefits to it. Honestly, it's the easiest opportunity. It's a very large scale opportunity for companies to address this problem.
So the next two questions are kind of related, which is, as individuals are looking at kind of the skills they may possess against kind of the credentials or experience that are needed in a job description, how do we help individuals be able to articulate in a way that employers could see that path despite the barriers we've acknowledged employers may put up? And so part of it is kind of like, how do they, articulate the skills that are more likely than not needed in the workplace?
Right. Well, honestly, I think here too, Peter, it does start with employers, because a very large percentage of job descriptions that are put up there are not actually skills-based. And so I think it's very important for an employer to send a signal, like a target to shoot at. What skills do you need for the job? If you say you need to have done exactly this for the last 15 years of your life, or 10 years of your life and you need these degrees and everything, then a star doesn't need, you know, a skills description. They need a time machine. They need to go back in time and like do all those things. But so in other words, if you can get a job opportunity based on your skills, well, there's a way to get new skills. It's called learning. But if you can only get a job opportunity based on your pedigree, getting new pedigree is called lying, right? And so we basically created on the employer side an impossible problem to solve. And so, but if you have a skills-based signals among employers, and there's lots of ways to do it. I mean, on Stellar Works, you can drop in your normal thing, and we just translate it. I mean, and so that is a thing that you can do. But then I think it's very important for intermediaries too that are working with people. So individuals, if they are given like a skills description, they can be pretty good at getting their skills. Now, here's an area where women, people of color, people who have not been are less likely, they will tend to underplay their description of their skills. So it's very helpful for intermediaries to kind of help do that. And it's also helpful for software. Again, we love working with the kind of programs like the community colleges you're talking about that have competency-based curricula, because we can translate that into skills descriptions and we can map it to those jobs. So I think it's fair. Yes, everybody can do a better job of describing skills, but we honestly need much more support for that. I mean, why, you know, you describe them in Workday if you're a big company, you know, like you have tools to support, and we are really determined to make it possible to turn all of those big systems onto inclusion mode by using the skill signals that are being generated like at the grassroots through Stellar Works and the like. So we think there's a path there.
So in many respects, you're helping to create a taxonomy so that you can actually make the connections between individuals and employers.
In a dynamic taxonomy. So in some employers are more comfortable thinking, they think campus hiring, so they think, oh, well, what programs might I do? Other employers are very much into sort of skills assessments and performance tasks. And so, okay, well, which one's there? Well, sometimes why not the same one? I mean, you have stars do the same performance task, maybe contextualize it a little bit differently, but don't screen them out and prevent them from doing it. You know, and some are very interested in apprenticeships. It's a perfect model. It's a very good model, both into like say community colleges, but also into call centers or to drivers, or, you know, because you know what skills, so initial set of skills you come with. So there's a lot of ways to do it. So what I would say the most important thing is to do it on purpose, right? Because that's a lot better than like by accident, and doing it together is the second most important thing. And this is a more subtle point, but the reason I think an organization like Greater Houston Partnership is such, and the other kind of intermediaries are so important to this, is that any one company, yes, you will find stars that could do the job, but the average star applying for your job is not going to do it because 400 people apply to the job and you pick one. Okay, so 399 didn't get that job, but that doesn't mean they are not prepared for any job. So what's really powerful is to bring the big companies in, and they will find talent, and then others will take their shot at those jobs with those big companies, and they might not be ready yet for that job, but they might be ready for another job at one of those companies, or they might be ready for the same job in one of their suppliers, right? Or they might be, so it actually, all the diversity of people, all the diversity of skills, all the diversity of methods, all the diversity of companies and their needs, 80% of that can be netted out through this marketplace approach and this database approach. And then the other 20% that doesn't net out, well, now you know where you really have a shortage and where you want to invest in pipeline. And so we are really committed to helping sort of like places like Houston and so all of their industries to understand what really are the gaps they have and to unlock investment behind them, but to use matching and to remove this bias to allow the whole system to work better, more dynamically, and send the right signals.
So I'm going to come back to the apprentice piece in just a second, but there's a question in here about kind of, you know, independent contract gig, you know, work, and how do folks take that as a way to kind of, you know, think about how they move themselves up into stars?
Yeah, well, I think there's a tremendous opportunity there. I mean, first of all, as I think probably everyone on this call knows, there's a tremendous variety of what's happening in contract and gig work. There are people who, you know, who have good jobs and use gig jobs to supplement, you know, their income. There are people who they lost their jobs and they're having trouble getting in. That's the next, they think that's the next best opportunity. I mean, so I don't want to kind of stereotype those roles because a lot of things are going on there. But I will say in general, probably the dominant kind of segment is people who it's kind of like a second best. It's a fallback. Like they don't have it, and so they're doing these gig roles. What's interesting though is all of these gig platforms are giving performance feedback, right? Like they're giving skills feedback, and what you can get with that is another gig. But so why can't you integrate those skill signals so that you could get another gig if that's what you want, but you could also get a job because you've shown that you can perform those tasks. So I'm very interested in how to make gig work more like itself, almost like an apprenticeship platform where you can demonstrate those skills and then you can move in if you want to, which I think a lot of people do, into more full-time employment that leverages those skills. I think that's a huge opportunity as well.
I mean, that's also another opportunity for employers to rethink how they even think about internships, which is,
yes,
can we do some project-based internships that allow folks to develop very defined kind of skills that allow them to take that into their portfolio?
I agree with that, Peter. And you can do that for people outside your company from the gig platforms or however you want to do it. But you can also do that for people inside your company and to give them the opportunity to show what they can do and to be able to then potentially move up into other jobs you need to fill.
So we're on a tight time frame right now, as I see, but I suspect we can run over just a hair. One, because we've got a lot of good questions, but there are a couple questions related to the incarcerated and criminal justice involved. And I know they have opportunities to be stars as well. Can you address that fairly quickly?
Yeah. So I've spent most of my career in the tech sector, and I spent some of my career in the nonprofit and governmental sector. And nonprofit and government tends to try to solve things in programs, and tech tends to solve things in layers and modules. And I think the tech method is a lot more adaptive. So take this kind of, if people need record expungement, that's a layer. If people need support, I think it's like I think there's a huge contribution that can be made. Employers, what we find most employers are looking for, and I'm talking stars now for a second, I'll get back to formerly incarcerated. They're saying, how are other employers making it work? And so what fundamentally happens in our platform in Stellar Works, it's a recommendation engine that you're saying as an employer, this is what I'm looking for. And you're getting feedback based on what other employers looking for the same things in the same ways, the same places, how have they gotten that? And that, if you think about that, that will help a lot. That whole method is very powerful for formerly incarcerated people, because of course there's huge barriers, like all the barriers that stars face, plus many more, and not just to employment, but to housing and lots of things for their life stability. So it is a major problem, and there's a huge number of people we're talking about. So, but I think if you try to solve that purely as a program, in a program way, where you have to sort of address every single one of these problems, or else you don't get there, I think that's tough. So I think there's a potential for those focused on the formerly incarcerated to be focused on the close wraparounds, and then be able to plug in with the skills signals these folks have. And on the other side, companies who want to hire people who are formerly incarcerated and are trying to figure out the best way and the best roles and all of that, they can plug in and they can learn what other companies are doing. And I think that is a much faster way to sort of reach kind of scale. I mean, really, it's kind of a learning machine. Like, how does it work well? And how can I try it? How can I de-risk it? eBay was my client in the early aughts. And these were garage sale markets where you had to go and see the merchandise, and they turned it into a global market. And the reason why was the reputation engine. I've never heard of this little organization. I don't know if I'm going to get what I want, but 400 other people who wanted the same thing got it and were satisfied. And I think there's such a like, of all populations, this is where the risk perception is highest, and de-risking that through these kinds of approaches, I think, is really important contribution that we can make. Now, the work, there's a lot of on the ground work. There's amazing organizations doing that work. And a lot of that is very hand to hand, but we need a piece of it that can scale into employment.
Yeah, and just to put an exclamation point on it, and I totally agree, the wraparound services for the formerly incarcerated are critically important. But one of the things I think employers need to acknowledge is most of these individuals have been in prison doing work, whether it's electrical, plumbing. I mean, these prisons don't run on the prison system hiring folks, outside folks to do jobs that the prisoners can do. And so there's a whole host of occupations these individuals have been doing. And I think that's one of the other things we just have to acknowledge in addition to all the wraparounds.
And what a great opportunity to sort of map the skills of those occupations to the skills of your job. So again, what we're trying to create, we're not trying to solve the whole end-to-end problem. We understand, in fact, we more than understand, we've created a seat at the table for these organizations. Stellar Works explicitly, when I say multi-sided, it's stars, it's employers, but it's also intermediaries, it's community colleges, it's, talent developers of all sorts. And really, they play such a critical role. But that your insight there, Peter, about the jobs they've done, I think the system is well equipped to do that. So we're open to that kind of collaboration.
So two last questions. One, it should be fairly short, but really, what is this opportunity occupations tool? And I know that Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia has something similar.
That is,
that's
what I was referring to, by the way. The Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia's Opportunity Occupations been a collaboration, several regional Federal Reserve banks, most notably Philadelphia. Atlanta's got a great visualization tool. But if you just type into search engine, Opportunity Occupations Federal Reserve, you'll see a lot of resources. We didn't create something separate from that. We worked with the Federal Reserve to sort of help structure that, and that data is partly incorporated into that index.
No, that's helpful. And so the final question really is kind of this last question, because I'm going to go back to where you started, which is, this is fundamentally about corporate leadership, corporate culture, and breaking down some of those biases. And so the final question I want to put out there is, what amount of this is attributable to company culture? And, what does it take to do that? And I know you have kind of three kind of quick headlines about what companies should do to kind of address that.
I think that companies can, well, for one thing, I think you need to start with company behavior and company systems. And I think culture change is hard to do, in my view, just as an independent exercise. So to me, what I think companies should do is, first of all, adopting a skills-based approach and thinking really hard about, okay, what are the skills we need, and taking seriously the skills that are out there, and build a system around it. Like, I'm not saying there's 50 different ways you could do this. I'm not suggesting that every company do all 50 ways. I'm suggesting that you should find the way that kind of works for you. That's the alternative. So there's the skills part, there's the alternative routes part. And I think companies do, for example, great partnerships with a single community college. That often happens, and it should happen more. But what's powerful is you can create essentially a partnership that can scale more, because it's a skills-based signal. And so any source, community college or others, that have access to a talent pool can sort of plug in. So in other words, it's like you're sending your signal out into the world, and it's coming back. So that's a big deal. And then I think getting to a level of critical mass of hiring is probably a prerequisite in what we've seen to really do culture change. Because if you're just hiring one or two people every once in a while, the focus of it is not there. And I think the final thing is on the culture change part of it is think hard about the positive attributes, the distinctive attributes that you're bringing into your company when you bring in a new talent pool. Don't just think about it as like, oh, well, yeah, they can do the job like this. That's true. But you also get, if you're a consumer company, for example, you get access to a lot of different sort of consumer understanding. So I just think people bring such a wide array of talents, and having a culture that can value a tremendous diversity of talents, a tremendous diversity of contributions, a tremendous diversity of kind of origins and destinations makes you a better company. And I will say, what we've seen with a lot of the companies that are working with us there's 4 or 5 places where we're working, they're learning a lot about their talent brand perception, about how they describe, that actually helps them in all the rest of their hiring and in all the rest of putting their company forward and building the culture. So we think it's not really, I think there's this kind of fear that you can have an inclusive culture, an innovative culture, but I think the opposite is true, that you've really got an ability here to do the kind of inclusive innovation, and ultimately that's more effective and it's more sustainable.
Because I think there are other things, getting to the culture part, is when companies also begin to look at, and we were talking about it, how do they look internally and create mobility within, which creates a huge dynamic in a positive way in terms of supporting promotions, which is just that signals to a ton of folks that this employer, this company is one that values people.
I totally agree, Peter. And I think what we've seen is if a company starts with this external stars hiring, it'll take about somewhere between 5 minutes and 5 days between the time people in the company say, well, why aren't we doing this with our own people? And that's right. So they start there, they'll get, and they should, that's absolutely right. And I think it's if you companies that are worried that they don't have enough information, we try to lower that information barrier, but yeah, start with your own people, right? And yeah, because at the end of the day, it's not sustainable to be bringing in stars from the outside, but not allowing your own people to rise. And if you build a system that allows that dynamism, you're going to get so much more out of your people. You're going to get more retention. The domain knowledge, the company culture that walks out the door because you've given them no way to advance their own kind of situation. It's really a kind of a tragedy for companies. It's very costly in a way that sometimes shows up clearly on the bottom line. A lot of other times you don't notice, but it's a bleed, And so, yeah, I think that's really important. And at the end of the day, how can you build a culture in a company that really values everyone's contribution and encourages people to bring their best selves, their full selves, to make the most contribution to the company, if you literally have structured it so there's 100 ways you're trying, you say oh, no, you shouldn't try. No, you shouldn't try that. Just because you don't have this piece of paper. I think you do real damage to the underlying sense of entrepreneurialism and sense of aspiration and sense of ownership in your company when you put up all these arbitrary barriers.
Yeah, and so in summary, some of the artificial barriers are the degree requirements.
Mm-hmm.
I also know there are GPA requirements at some level.
Oh yeah, we've seen that too.
Oh,
well, there, and there's which schools did you went to and all the rest of it. It's come on. That's something we've seen a lot. In engineering, there's people who only want to, recruit from Stanford. Well, have you heard of Purdue? You know what I mean? But it goes all the way up and all the way down the chain. It's sort of these markers, these proxies are not the people. The people are so much more than those proxies, so.
No, and I just found, some of the GPA things, which is when you think about who's likely to be at a 3.0 or so,
absolutely,
they're probably working part-time. They're probably, working their way through. They have the grit and perseverance, but all of a sudden we're sending a signal, which is we need a 3.5 or something above that. Yeah. And so I think removing those kind of pieces.
Absolutely. So one of actually, she's now the chair of our STARS Advisory Council, someone who I've worked with for several years. I met when I was in the White House and was starting this initiative. Her name is Lashana Lewis. She grew up in East St. Louis. She always worked with computers. She didn't manage to finish college because of family and a lot of other things that we're talking about. And she couldn't get a job in the tech field back in St. Louis for 12, 15 years. And she finally got to a nonprofit who didn't train her, even just validated her skills to companies. She got a job at MasterCard. She got promoted twice. She now, she became CTO of another company. She now runs her own company. And what Lashana said, and I'll just never forget it was actually it was at Accenture in DC when we launched this first report on STARS. She said, now that I'm successful in the tech field, everybody wants to tell me that I'm one in a million. She said, but I know I'm one of millions. And that's exactly right. She is one of millions, and no one can meet her and see what she can do and say you wouldn't want her like at your company. But there's millions of people like her who you're excluding every day without even noticing.
I'm going to leave it there because that's a great way to end it, which is to remind folks there are millions of these folks. You have started a conversation for us, Byron, that I cannot thank you enough for. And I also, want to acknowledge, how we got introduced, which is through the American Petroleum Institute and Chevron, right, and a bunch of energy companies that are really beginning to explore this. And I know I've gone way over, but very few people dropped off, which means we're on target for something that we need to, as a community, work on.
And along with API and those companies, there are 28 companies signed up. We're coming to Houston, and like this infrastructure, this data infrastructure, and the match will be available to Houston. We certainly hope to be working very closely with Greater Houston Partnership and others. But this we're open for business, and we definitely want to get. Our model is not. We come in and sort of say, hey, Houston, here's how it works. We offer the platform and the data so that engaged companies, engaged schools, educators, and engaged intermediaries can do their best work. The work is still hard, but it gets much further with these tools, and it's more sustainable, and you can grow it faster. And at the end of the day, the one thing you can always count on is, there's going to be a couple million stars in Houston that are sort of busting their rear ends to try to figure out how they can contribute more at your company and get paid for it, right? So they're all definitely going to be there. They're going to show up. So the rest of us need to show up and kind of work together to open those doors.
And so this is our signal, Byron and others, that this is not going away, because another one of your partners, which is Markle's Rework America Alliance, is coming here as well, which is really focused on this skills-based approach. So
right,
we're going to create.
Yeah, they've got a lot of tools for that. Yep, there's many ways to go about it, but you got to start, and you got to do it on purpose, and hopefully you'll do it together.
So hopefully in a year we might have moved up a level.
Yeah, right.
It may take a little bit of time and a little bit of effort.
You're not the only one moving, but I think Houston's definitely. Houston's got its act together a little more than many places. So I think you probably could do it if you wanted to.
Well, thank you, Byron. It has been a true pleasure to have you and host you. We really appreciate the great work you've done and the insights you've shared. I want to thank the audience for participating in our forum today. It has been great. We will have some others in the future. A couple, just signals of where we might be going is we're in a discussion with the Commissioner for Higher Education, Harrison Keller, to do a UpSkill Works Forum with him. We're in a conversation with Steve Goldsmith, the former mayor of Indianapolis, to come share and talk about his new book about growing fairly, which this fits right into it. And so we're looking forward to this, and you'll hear more from us in the coming weeks as we set those new pieces to it. So once again, Byron, thank you so much for coming to Houston today virtually. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you.